Hello. I'm Nancy McGaw, Deputy Director of the Aspen Institute Business and Society Program, and I am delighted to welcome all of you today to this webinar, which we're very excited about. We can't wait to dive into this conversation with Mauro Guillén about his important new book, 2030, Today's Biggest Trends, how today's biggest trends will collide and reshape the future of everything. That's a big title. It's a big book. The book, which was just released on August 25th, is already on the Wall Street Journal's best-selling list, which is terrific. And I think that recognition is hardly a surprise. The book is not only eye-opening, but it's an engrossing read. Mauro, I was especially interested to see how deftly you used cultural references throughout the book. You know, authors, movies, what have you. Here's an example. One of the chapters in the book is called More Cell Phones Than Toilets. And one of the sections is labeled, It All Began with Dick Tracy and Superman. So who can resist it? The book itself is really irresistible and very informative about what may be coming our way. And really, as a reader, I believe, Mauro, that you accomplished what you set out to do. You say at the end of the book that your mission was really to help your readers see the unseeable and to really show us what trends are changing the world as we know it, and we'd better be ready. So without further delay, I want to introduce the two guests who joined me on this screen. Mauro is the Zanman Professor of International Management at Wharton. He is trained as a sociologist and political economist and is a leading thinker and innovator in management education. And I'm pleased to note that in 2013, we recognized Mauro for his excellence with our Aspen Faculty Pioneer Award. And here today to interview Professor Guillén about his book is Rebecca Henderson, the John and Natty MacArthur University professor at Harvard. And she is also, I'm happy to say, a recipient of an Aspen Teaching Award. So we know that some of you may have joined us a month ago when the tables were turned. And Mauro was actually interviewing Rebecca on her important new book called Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. And if you weren't able to join that conversation, I really recommend you find the conversation online and listen in. So we are thrilled to bring the two of you innovative and influential thinkers together again today for this second conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to you in just a sec. But I want to remind all of the viewers, you've been on Zoom calls before, you know there's that button at the bottom, the Q&A box, and please type in any questions that you have for Mauro, and Rebecca will integrate them into the conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn this virtual stage over to you, Mauro, and Rebecca.
Yes, thank you so much, Nancy, for your kind introduction. I think Rebecca will begin the proceedings here.
That was my plan, Mauro. And let me just double down on what Nancy said. I really enjoyed the book. I've already recommended it to the CEO of the boards that I'm on. I think it's something that all boards should read, and to a number of other groups of senior leaders that I know. I mean, you do such a wonderful job of persuading us that things are going to really change in the next 10 years. And you give us a very concrete sense of what that might look like. And I think that's incredibly valuable. So let me begin by asking you a few questions. But before I do that, let me double down on Nancy's suggestion. If you'd like to ask Mauro a question, please type it into the Q&A and I will weave it into my conversation with Mauro. And we're very, very keen to have everyone who's on the call involved in the conversation. Mauro, what was the most surprising thing you learned writing this book? The book is full of amazingly bizarre facts, My personal favorite is that the women in Siberia are pushing hard to legalize polygamy. But, you know, what is it you found most surprising as you started to do this research? And you mentioned you've been researching this book for 2 or 3 years. So what came up that you didn't expect?
Well, there were many things, Rebecca, and once again, thank you for playing this role today. I think it's just been wonderful to go through this experience of having an intellectual exchange with you. First on your book a few weeks ago, and then today on mine. I've been enriched by this experience. And I think the part of the research that I did, or the finding, the thing that I came across that surprised me the most is the extent to which, no matter how effective or revolutionary or innovative new technologies may be, that unless there are other circumstances that are present, especially in terms of demographics, especially in terms of how the economy is evolving, that those technologies perhaps have no, success out there, right? That was perhaps, the most important thing for me, to realize that you really need a conspiracy, right? You need a lot of things to fall in place for, big new, developments, especially in the field of technology. And I say this with some caution here, because of course you are one of the preeminent scholars of technology and how companies and the economy overall use technology. And I do want to say something, Rebecca, that we've known each other for many years, that I think is really important, that, the conceptual point that really, dawned on me was that, look, we have all of these things going on in the world, right? And I think this will, what I'm about to say, will resonate with one of your key contributions, which is that it doesn't matter so much each of the pieces. What matters is how the pieces come together. Yeah. The architecture of the whole thing, right? And of course, you made a name for yourself, a few years ago with this concept of how architecture really matters. And I think that's what the book is about, right? The book is about all of these things that maybe you've heard, like, yes, women are becoming, more important in the economy. Yes, we have in population aging. Yes, now we have technology platforms taking over the world. Those are the pieces. But what really matters is, how do those pieces come together? And that's what really surprised me about doing the research for this book, which is that Rebecca Henderson was right. And what matters is the architecture, right? But more importantly, and this is the main message of the book, is the lateral thinking that you have to engage in, right? You have to look for those lateral connections, because things that may be a priori are completely unrelated. Once you dig into them and you see all of the different pieces interact, then you realize, oh my goodness, babies in China are connected to what's happening at shopping malls in the United States, right? And that is, I think, the main message from the book. And it's what I really learned that surprised me, because I not that I didn't, understand that architecture matters, right, at the end of the day, but it really surprised me the extent to which it's actually central to our understanding of what's going on in the world of business, in the economy, in the society, pretty much everything, right, in the world.
So let me press you just a little bit on that point. What are some of the key lateral connections that really jumped out? And I think your example of Chinese babies is changing what's happened in US shopping malls. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. But can you give us sort of, what are the sort of 2 or 3 things that we might want to start with, just to give us a flavor of the kind of connections you were able to make?
Give you one example, and then we can expand from there, right? As you know, most people believe that demography is not destiny, and I agree with that general statement. Having said that, population changes, I think, are very important, and that's why I used this title for the first chapter in the book, Follow the Babies, right? Because I want to talk about the future. So one great way of thinking about the future is thinking about how many babies are being born, in what parts of the world, who are they, and what is likely to happen to them over the next 10 years or so. And just to give you a specific example of this, one of the things that I find, and I make a big deal out of in the book, is that by the year 2030, for the first time, given these demographic times, we're going to have more grandparents and grandchildren in many countries around the world, including China, most of Europe, and here in the United States, right? And so in the book, then, I make all sorts of lateral connections regarding that. So I bring in another very important fact. 80% of the net worth in the US is owned by people above the age of 60, right? So that doesn't mean that everybody who is a senior citizen is rich. Of course not. But what it means is that, well, for the starters, consumer markets everywhere in the world are going to change because the largest consumer segment in terms of purchasing power by the year 2030 will be people above the age of 60. And let me just add another thing here. A few years ago, in preparation for one of the classes that I teach at Wharton, I was looking into how come that our major clothing retailers don't have clothes, products specifically designed for people in their 60s or their 70s. So I'm talking about some of the biggest brands in the world right now. And I dug into that question. The answer was they were concerned that their brand image would be tarnished if they were to carry clothes for people in their 60s or their 70s. And that's how I got into all of these lateral connections. So starting with the babies, but ending up with what is it that clothing companies are doing and why are they missing on what could be one of the most significant shifts in consumer markets over the next 10 years, which is the fact that this segment is going to become the largest in the world. So that's one example of how I start making connections across all of these different things in the book.
In a moment, I'm going to ask you how a manager develops lateral thinking. You know, you suggest it's a great thing, but like, how does one do it? But let me ask you just a couple of questions about some of the amazing facts that are in the book for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet. You talk not only about how important the gray segment is going to be, but you also talk about the shift to China. And I think that in itself is not new. We all kind of get that China is going to be very big and very important. But you really stress Africa and India. And I guess as I was reading it, I thought, oh, I hope so. But I've read so many books about Africa rising and India rising, and they've just both been hit by the COVID pandemic. Mm-hmm. Their economies are on their heels. Climate change is going to follow up quickly. You know, there's going to be massive fires and droughts, and they're going to run out of water. And really, why do you remain confident that we're going to see enormous growth in both regions?
So in spite of everything that you've said, and I'm keenly aware of those issues, especially right now in the middle of this pandemic, I continue to be bullish, right, on both India and Sub-Saharan Africa. And yes, talking about the year 2019 may sound like prehistory right now because the situation has shifted. But in that year, 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world were in Sub-Saharan Africa. What gives me, I think, quite a bit of optimism is that we're seeing the middle class grow from very low levels in both of those countries. And you see, Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa is a big place. There's nearly 50 countries. If you count Northern Africa, there's more than 50, as you know, in that continent. But just 5 or 6 big metropolitan areas in Africa account for the bulk of what's going on there in terms of the growth of the middle class. And these are places that are proving to be very dynamic. And we should not forget also that Africa has pioneered certain things that are now becoming big trends, for example, in the United States, such as telemedicine or even mobile payments. So I continue to be bullish, but having said that, I must admit that what's going on right now because of the pandemic gives me some pause. China has apparently managed to bring the pandemic under control. But India and, for example, South Africa are reporting really, really bad numbers. So yes, I am a little bit more guarded in my optimism about those two parts of the world. But I think, if we adopt a 5 to 10 year time horizon, I think I continue to be optimistic about them. And I do believe that all of us who work at institutions that are educating the next generation of students and managers, that we need to tell them about what's going on in those parts of the world. Because you see, the other way of looking at it, Rebecca, is that for better or worse, Africa is going to change the world. Yeah. For better, if actually the kinds of things that I predict in the book become a reality. But for worse, if somehow something goes wrong. We can no longer ignore Africa, given how big it's becoming from a population point of view.
So Mauro, your answer, which I thought was fabulous, leads directly into two questions that people online would like to ask you. Let's not forget, how does a manager develop lateral thinking? We will go there, but these two questions just follow up so beautifully. This is from Peter Merman. I've not been able to read the book, but when there are many trends that interact, how do you predict the architecture of all these trends? Typically, interaction between many different elements is hard to predict. So how do you know which one will come about? And I want to pair that with a question from Miguel Padró, who says, well, you know, how do you see political and economic power shifting in the next 10 years? You know, my version of this is, your book paints a pretty rosy picture of 2030, but I can give you a pretty bleak one. And, you know, what has to happen for that to happen? So, you know, how did you pick where you ended up? How are you thinking about this set of questions?
Yeah. So great questions. And I think you mentioned the name Peter Merman. So a good friend of, I think, both of us, if it's the Peter Merman I'm thinking about. So Peter, thank you for your question. Also, thank you for the other question. So I think the key issue here is whether all of those changes, and I recognize in the book that there are a lot of moving parts here. There's a lot of balls in the air. But the question is whether those changes actually reinforce each other or they don't. To the extent, only to the extent that they reinforce each other, then one can tell 5 years or 10 years, you know, from now, where we may be landing. And as I explain in the book, I believe that most of these trends, most of these changes that I document in it across the different chapters are reinforcing each other, right? So it's no coincidence, I think, that, for example, China right now, let me just give you a very simple example, is trying to gravitate away from an export-led model of economic growth towards more of a development of the internal market. But that trend gets reinforced with another fact that we know about China, which is one of the countries in the world that is aging most quickly, right? And therefore, like the United States, it's going to have this concentration of some important proportion of the net worth or the wealth in that age group. So all of those trends, demographic, economic, and also in terms of where the consumer market in China is going and what's going on geopolitically in the world in terms of tensions, trade wars, and so on and so forth, they all reinforce each other. And they're taking us to a future in which China is actually going to become more like the United States in terms of an economy that is more reliant on its own internal domestic market. Having said that, of course, we also see at the same time China as a country expanding in other parts of the world and trying to assert its influence, especially in places, as you know, that are strategic to them in terms of natural resources and so on and so forth. So again, I think the answer to these paired questions, Rebecca, is it really depends on whether the trends reinforce themselves or whether they, you know, take us in different directions and therefore make it extremely difficult to predict exactly where we're going to end up being.
Fabulous. So now let me move to the question I have highlighted.
Okay.
This is from Carlos Lagasha Martinez. How can a manager best develop lateral thinking? And I would add to that, how does a firm best develop lateral thinking? Because there's an individual question, but there's also an organizational question, right? So, can you handle both?
Absolutely. So Rebecca, let me just begin by noting that that is the question that one should ask of a Harvard professor rather than a Wharton professor, right? Because as you know, the emphasis at your school is more on what is it that the top person at the firm should be doing, right? As a result of this. But we also try to address that question at Wharton, although our reputation lies elsewhere. And I think the answer to that question is relatively straightforward. So let me emphasize 3 points. And this is what I try to convey in the concluding chapter of the book. Okay, after everything has been said and done about these trends, how can we make sense out of these trends and, more importantly, make decisions? So the first point that I would say is, first of all, we have to overcome the human instinct right, of denial that things are changing. And also, very importantly, this other bias that psychologists have documented time and again, that we tend to get scared by massive change. And we resort to essentially trying to minimize the losses as opposed to trying to explore the potential gains. So that is the first point. Okay, so we need to change our mindset more broadly, not just managers, but everyone. And in a moment, I will address the organizational issue that you mentioned, Rebecca. The second point, I think, which is really important is, look, there's no possible response to change than change itself, right? So we need to also think about that, both at the level of the individual and the organization. And then thirdly, that when so many things are out of whack and they're changing, that our impulse is to either freeze and not do anything. That's one extreme. Or the other extreme is to then change everything, reinvent our whole lives and careers, to reinvent the whole organization. And I'm more in favor of a more incremental approach. And more importantly, one that is based on options, right? So don't make any decision that is irreversible. Try to take one step at a time. Try to keep the door open behind you, but by all means, don't freeze. Continue making decisions, continue adapting to this very dynamic situation. So that's the answer at the individual level and in part at the organizational level. But at that level, Rebecca, what I would add is something really, really important. As you know, organizations have this tendency to either ossify, right? So they become frozen in time and they just fall victim to inertia, to the forces of inertia, or they just simply fall apart, right? And so I think organizational leaders, but also the people who report to those leaders in organizations, well, they need to be conscious about in terms of coping with all of this is that very simple thing, which is that what delivered success in the past is unlikely to deliver success in the future, right? And that there's nothing wrong with breaking with the tradition and breaking with whatever, gave us success in the past as an organization. And that may require cultural change, right? In the sense of all of those things that we took for granted, all of those things that we thought were constants and we could actually build on them, we may have to revisit them. And this is, I think, the message that I try to send in the book. It's like, I'm optimistic because I think human beings are capable of revisiting the assumptions that they make about what's going on. But unless we do that, it's going to be really hard. And let me just give you one quick example, right? And we've been making the assumption over the last 100 years that life progresses in stages. First, we go to school, then we work, and then we retire. I think we have to revisit that assumption. We're going to have to go back to school several times because of how rapidly things are changing and knowledge is becoming obsolete. And by the way, retirement is oversold. And by the time people celebrate their 60th birthday, and 12,000 people in the US are celebrating their 60th birthday today, 210,000 globally, you still have another 25 years on average of life expectancy. Even more than that if you're a woman. So that's a lifetime. We need to abandon that assumption. And by the way, companies continue to reinforce that assumption because we're still asking people to work at the company during the prime years and then retire. We get rid of them, right? And we don't allow people to go back to school so that they can retool and all of these sorts of things. So that's just one important thing that I think organizations need to revisit is they need to revisit all of those assumptions. I've just given you one example.
Thank you very much, Mauro. I have a question from Carlos Barrera. What are your thoughts on future trends for Latin America? What are the opportunities this region has to improve their global standing?
Yeah, so Carlos, I'm glad you asked that question. To tell you the truth, in the book, I don't probably refer to Latin America as much as it deserves, at least on a proportional basis. It is a very important part of the world. But look, Latin America is somewhere in between US and Europe on the one hand, and the other emerging markets in the world, right, on the other hand. It's somewhere in between, because Latin America developed earlier than China, than India, certainly than Sub-Saharan Africa, most of Latin America at least. And so it's caught up somewhere in the middle. Latin America has a middle class that is already 2 or 3 generations old. But like the middle class in the US, which is 5 generations old, it's stuck. It's not growing any longer, right? Latin America has 5 beautiful years followed by 10 years that are awful, and then on and on and on. It just goes through these cycles, right? So I think that the answer to aligning Latin America with this trend certainly is not what's going on in many of these places, which is that now they have populist leaders and they have companies that have essentially given up on being competitive, and they've engaged in corrupted or corrupt practices. We have so many examples, from all over the region in the last few years. And I think that, the single most important thing, and I do refer to this in the book, is that I think what's missing in a place like Latin America more broadly is investment in their people, right? A bet on, hey, this is a knowledge-based economy. This is a situation in which human capital, or however you want to call it, has to be flexible and adaptable. And I don't think those types of investments are being made right now. And as a result of that, I think that the stability and the growth of the middle class in Latin America is going to suffer. To a certain extent, you could say the same thing about the United States, but the US, of course, as a country, as an economy, as a society, is several orders of magnitude above Latin America in terms of development in so many respects, right? So I think Latin America's problem right now is that it's stuck in neutral, and it's stuck in the middle, in between the emerging markets that are growing like crazy in Asia, Middle East, and Africa, on the one hand, and Europe, the United States, Japan, which are themselves kind of stagnant, right? And have been for quite a while in many respects.
I have a question from Vinette Sharma, which actually aligns with one of my own. And we talked a little bit about this before we came on screen. Your projections for the strength of the gray class and all that buying power that's going to happen over 60 are super interesting, particularly if you're about to cross that threshold yourself. But, Vinette points out that interest rates are close to zero, that many public pension plans look like they're not going to be able to manage the returns that they'd hoped for. I would add to it, yes, people over 60 have 80% of the wealth, but 1% of the people over 60 have 80% of the wealth. So I'll believe they have lots of purchasing power, but aren't they going to buy yachts? I mean, aren't there going to be a lot of people who are going to be very badly hit? So how should we think about, if we unpack what's going to happen to the gray class, how should we think about that?
Yeah. So yes. So once again, I do analyze this time and again in the book. We are in an unequal world, and a world that is becoming more unequal in terms of the distribution of income. And of course, the distribution of wealth matters even more. So let me point out how important it is then to revisit some of the assumptions that we've already talked about, including the assumption that we go through stages in life. So here in the United States, the trustees of the Social Security Administration, they issue a report every year, and they calculate, as you know, the financial stability of the pension system, public pension system here in the United States. And they have something that they call the financial ratio. And if that ratio falls below 100%, then the system is in trouble. And you know what? The report that was published just a few months ago predicts that if current trends continue, the ratio will fall below 100% towards the end of 2029. Okay, so just in time for 2030 to be a moment of reckoning. What can change that? Well, we can change that if we redefine what retirement means. I think we're going to have more hybrid arrangements whereby people use some of these platforms that we have, use remote work, use the gig economy to continue doing something. And therefore, for example, not feeling as isolated. Remember, loneliness is one of the biggest problems in old age, right? And they will be able to earn some money. But the other aspect, which we haven't talked about, and as you know, Rebecca, I made a big deal out of this, especially in the first chapter of the book, is immigration. So we've gotten ourselves into this mindset that the costs of immigration outweigh the benefits. And as you know, every single study, and I quote in the book extensively from the ones conducted by the National Academies of Science, every single study about immigration in the United States, as well as in many other countries, Australia, Canada, so many others, point out that at the end of the day, immigration delivers more benefits than costs. So this is one of the messages that I really want to convey in the book, which is that, look, immigration is going to be a fact of life for a long time because we have a surplus of babies in some parts of the world, and we have a deficit of babies in other parts of the world. And migration is just the natural way of trying to smooth out those trends. But the problem is that we are at a moment politically, I think, in which unfortunately, populist politicians tend to exploit the issue to their advantage, right? And, our bias is going back to the psychologists. So I'm specifically thinking about Daniel Kahneman here and Tversky. Once again, we tend to attach more weight to the potential losses than to the potential gains, right? And so I think manipulating that human instinct in that way is essentially resulting in a situation in which most people now believe that immigration is bad. And there's nothing that will help us more, I think, as an economy, but also as a society in the future. And by the way, let me throw in another number that I refer to in the book, which is, I think, very important. Between 25 and 30% of the doctors, the nurses, and the nursing aides in the United States are foreign born. And even more importantly, 91% of the people who take care of the elderly in their homes in the United States are immigrants, right? So both Rebecca and I came to this country from somewhere else. We were lucky, I think, to find huge opportunities here that maybe we wouldn't have in our respective home countries. But what I'm trying to say here is that, I think we need to think out of the box as to not only how to persuade people that immigration is a good thing, but how to make immigration a great experience for both the immigrants themselves and, of course, the host country or the host society, in this case, the United States. And I don't think those of us who believe in immigration have done a good enough job. And that's something that I think we need to work harder at trying to persuade people and also put in place the kinds of policies. And all we need to do is look at Canada. As you know, Canada is actually trying to benefit from the fact that now immigration into the United States is more difficult. And they're putting in place policies that will facilitate, or will unleash all of those benefits for the country. So I think that's, we need to move the debate in that direction. And I feel that as a professor and as a researcher who cares about that, I think it's very important. And by the way, if there's anybody listening who is very keen on entrepreneurship, think about all of the companies that immigrants have founded in this country, right? So what is it that Tesla, Google, and so many other companies have in common? Well, they've changed the world. There's no question about it. But they've also been founded or co-founded by immigrants.
I really second your remarks, Mauro. The research is overwhelming in this case. I was a member of a commission set up at the Department of Commerce some years ago, charged to give recommendations for immigration. And our first one was every science degree that's issued in the United States, staple a green card to it. That it's been so important for US economic growth historically. It's been amazing. I have a question from an anonymous attendee. Okay. And they say, I can't help but think of Kate Raworth's donut. Are you familiar with donut economics?
Say that again. I couldn't hear you. Actually, repeat the question.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I can't help. Let me read the whole question. I can't help but think of Raworth's donut that introduces environmental limits. So Kate has a wonderful book called Donut Economics.
Yeah.
And the question is there any connection with regenerative economics and your emerging trends? How do you think about the interaction between the two?
So if I understood the question correctly, Rebecca, and I'm familiar with that argument, it's all about, we are in a world with finite resources. And what is the right approach in terms of thinking about the future and how much economic growth and how big a middle class we can have in the world, right? Because if I may turn the question or put the question in my own language, at the end of the day, we have a growing middle class in the world. The middle class likes to have a car. They like to go on vacation. They like to have a bigger house. They want to have air conditioning in the home. They like to travel. So to the extent that the middle class grows, especially in emerging markets, we're going to see more pressure on natural resources. We're going to see more climate change and so on and so forth, right? So let me first just answer with two very quick points, because this is not my biggest area of expertise, but I do refer to this problem in the book, right? And let me just push my answer as much as I can while being comfortable in terms of what I'm saying based on the evidence that I have. So the first point is that population growth is slowing down, and it's slowing down really quickly. I document this in the book, but instead of having a baby boom in future years, we're going to have a baby drought, right? That's going to be an even bigger problem, because the transition from a high fertility regime in the world to a low fertility regime is actually problematic because of all of these issues that we've been talking about with the viability of pensions and so on and so forth. So yes, there are babies being born in Africa, but that number is also dropping really, really quickly. And for heaven's sake, I mean, we do have technology and we do have policies that could diminish the effect on the environment and the effect on natural resources of whatever population growth we continue to have over the next 20 or 30 years. But in fact, most of the projections indicate that in 50 years from now, we're actually going to have a smaller population than the one that we have today. I mean, this is slowing down really, really quickly. That's the first point. The second point, if I may, is I have a chapter in the middle of the book, I think it's chapter 5 on cities. And I like to bring, this discussion to that, right? So I think the problem, and maybe Rebecca, you don't agree, but most of the problem with climate change involves cities, right? Because cities, as I mentioned in the book, occupy 1% of the land, but they're home to 55% of the population, and that's growing very quickly. By 2030, it will be 65% of the population, 2/3 of the total. And cities account for 80% of the carbon emissions, 80% of the carbon emissions. So the problem is cities. And that's why in the book, I essentially propose, look, I mean, whenever we're discussing these problems in terms of the limits to growth, the finite base of resources that we have, and climate change, which is another finite resource that we have, I mean, meaning a planet that can be inhabited, right? At the end of the day, it's a resource constraint. Well, I think that there's three things that we should be doing. Obviously, we should be investing in technologies that have the potential of transforming the way in which we relate to the environment, particularly about energy, but also in other fields like nanotechnology, new materials, and so on and so forth. Second is we need behavioral change. I mean, let's not forget, we waste about 1/3 of the food that we produce. And the agricultural sector is one of the most important contributors to climate change, right? And if you include the transportation cost of the food, it's really crazy, right? So we need behavioral change. And in the book, I really draw a lot on the research on nudging and on how we can introduce, whether it is incentives or any other kind of thing to change behavior, right? So that we are a little bit more environmentally conscious. And then the third thing I would say, but then Rebecca, you're the expert on this, is that I think we need more leadership from companies, right? I think business should be part of the solution in this. In your book, obviously, that is the solution that you're proposing, right? It's like, how can we mobilize business, right? And I agree with you. I mean, some of these businesses are so big that even if they make a small contribution, they can have a huge impact. And there is a business case to be made for it, right? So that's the way in which I respond. It's a three-pronged approach. In my book, I don't develop the last point. So for that, people will need to read your book, right? But the other 2 points I make very, very strongly. So number one is we have to change our behavior. Number two, we need to fix our cities. Most of the problem is in the cities. We haven't built the kinds of cities that are conducive to a good relationship between human beings and the environment.
Mauro, we only have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask what I suspect will be the last question. And this is from Chris Pinney. And it does, in fact, flow right into what you just said. So Chris wants to know, what is the role of business in addressing global challenges? And let me make that a little bit more specific. If we were all CEOs of the world's major companies, what would you like us to do to make what is, I think, to be fair, a pretty optimistic view of 2030 come true?
Yes.
It's a pretty optimistic view. So what do you think business should be focused on if your vision is really to be the one that we see?
Yeah, from the point of view of business. So thank you for the question, Rebecca. And in the book, this is the argument that I make, right? And I do it by example. So I essentially illustrate what I'm about to say with examples from large companies, not so large companies. So I also believe that medium-sized enterprises are really important in what they do and the decisions that they make. And then I also use a lot of examples of entrepreneurs and the brave ideas that they've come up with. And some of the examples that I use are companies that have not yet grown, and maybe they will disappear before somebody else succeeds with that idea. But essentially, the argument goes back to your question, Rebecca, about organizations, right? So how do we change organizations? Well, I think we need to change the people and the minds of those people in the organization. And then we need to make sure that there's nothing inside of those organizations, in this case businesses, that prevents those new bright ideas about what we could do to make it to the year 2030, with optimism, right? So that there's no obstacles inside of those organizations. So I think that you have, as I have, studied many companies that are large, and we've always, complained, you and I, about how bureaucratic and how fossilized they are in their ways of doing things, and how difficult it is to implement change. So I think it is extremely important. Do I believe that change has to come from the top? Yes, to a certain extent. But I also believe that people at lower levels in the organization can promote change. So in the book, I offer a lot of examples, again, from very large companies such as Philips or the watch companies to others, some really small ones, some of them entrepreneurial startups that are not even really incorporated as such, so they're mere ideas. All of those, I think, we need in order to tackle some of these issues and to ensure that by the year 2030, actually, we have a world that is better than we have today. So I continue to be optimistic even after all of these questions, okay? And I continue to be optimistic even in the midst of a pandemic. And let me just say one thing really quickly, 30 seconds, Rebecca, which is people oftentimes ask me, so you did the research or most of the research for this book before the pandemic struck. And I was only able to change a few things and to add a postscript to the book regarding the pandemic. But you see, most of the trends that I discuss in the book are being accelerated, intensified by the pandemic, with only a couple of exceptions. And so my only regret of publishing the book at the end of this summer is that instead of titling the book 2030, maybe I should have titled it 2028, because the future is coming our way much earlier, right? This pandemic is accelerating the future for the most part. Remote work, changes in supply chains around the world, how it's affecting different groups in society with the concomitant rising inequality. That future that we feared is coming up earlier. We need to change those fears, those threats, those challenges into opportunities. That is the name of the game right now.
Mauro, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. You should know that there are a whole bunch of additional questions that have come in. So your book and your talk has aroused enormous interest. Thank you very much for the work you've done.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's always a pleasure to have an intellectual conversation with you. And if I didn't answer a question, I will kindly invite the listeners to write to me via email, or they can also connect with me on LinkedIn. And I'll be very happy to have a separate conversation with them about those topics.
That's fantastic. Mauro, thank you very much. I think we're at an end. Nancy, you want to close us out?
I'm just going to say a final thank you to both of you. What a compelling and informative conversation. And really, to our listeners, I urge you to buy both of these books and read them in tandem. Because I've had the pleasure of reading them both very carefully. And I feel like what you've done with your writing and also, of course, with your teaching And your research has really shown some leadership that helps us figure out how we can face up to our denials and act with positive intent and really activate our moral imagination to get ready for what's coming at us. So thank you both very much for being here today and for all the work that you do. And thanks to our audience. And with that, we'll conclude.
Thank you.
Bye.